Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Aristotle, chapter 6. And what I want to do in this first lecture is draw some important distinctions between Plato and Aristotle. And we'll start with that. So first, I want to remind you that Aristotle was a pupil of Plato. So they were, we could say Plato was his mentor and teacher for almost 20 years. He was in the Plato's Academy in Athens. And so certainly there's going to be some similarities, but ultimately Aristotle rejects the Plato's ontology, metaphysics, epistemology, and we'll see how and why. So let me, these are going to be very general, but very important distinctions. So let's begin with otherworldliness. We've already seen that in the case of Plato, the allegory of the cave, the line analogy, theory of the forms, everything is in the invisible world, right? So for Plato, there is a visible world and an invisible world. The visible world represents the world of the senses, the empirical, experiential world. The invisible world represents the intellectual world, the world of abstract knowledge, the world of pure reason. And we know that for Plato, it's all about the invisible world. In the case of Aristotle, it's actually going to be the opposite. So Aristotle, at some point, talks about the possibility of a supernatural world, but most of his philosophy is going to take place in the natural world, in nature, in the visible world. He does not believe in the allegory of the cave. He believes that ultimately we obtain knowledge, as my next point will show, in this visible world. And so for Aristotle, the invisible world does not have the kind of importance that it has for Plato. Second point, of course, follows. If for Aristotle it's the visible world that is essential, then the objects of knowledge will be in the visible world. Now, here they do share a very important similarity, and that is that Plato and Aristotle both believe that the object of knowledge is correctly the forms, right? So Aristotle agrees with Plato that to know is to know the form of something. However, they disagree insofar as Aristotle would argue that the forms can be found in the empirical world. They lie embedded in the things themselves, and the forms of these things are not separable, from the things or from the objects in the physical world. Of course, we know for Plato that the form is separable and in fact exists in and of itself in the invisible world, right? There is the form, of humanness, the form of frog, the form of justice, the form of piety. For Aristotle, that's not the case. Piety exists in pious actions. Frogness exists in individual frogs. Humanity or humanness, human nature exists in individual human beings. So the object of knowledge is the same insofar as they both believe that to know is to know the form of something. However, for Aristotle, this is an empirical process that is known through sensation. For Plato, it's a rational process since the forms are something in the supernatural world, outside in the intellectual world, outside of the visible world. The third point, human nature, follows the same sort of pattern. So again, for Plato, human nature is constituted by our immaterial soul, which ultimately is the mind. But for Aristotle, this is not the case. For Aristotle, our human nature is composed of two parts: mind and body, soul and body. So these two parts for Aristotle are inseparable. Uh, and unlike in the case of Plato, we cannot imagine my soul existing without my body. In the case of Plato, we know, of course, that the body is simply a kind of vehicle that allows the soul to journey through the world of the physical world. Uh, but these are separable, and the soul can exist by itself, and in fact it could simply go on to the afterlife and maybe even enter into another body and so on, because I do not identify myself, according to Plato, with my body. I identify 100% only with my soul. So this is very different in Aristotle. Finally, I want to say something about the relativism and skepticism and ethics. So again, they share some similarities here. The similarities are that Aristotle is not a skeptic, just like Plato, and he's not a relativist either. So insofar as they are, they both believe that we can obtain knowledge of the universe, of the world, and so on, and that knowledge is objective and we can obtain universal um, knowledge of propositions that apply to everyone, obviously, and that are true for everyone. Insofar as they have those beliefs, they have something they share in common. However, for Aristotle, relativism and skepticism, or the defeating or undermining relativism and skepticism, is not a major objective of his philosophy. In some sense, we might, we're not sure exactly why. There might be different speculative reasons why, but one reason might be he might think that Plato already did this, right? He might just, Aristotle say, well, Plato has conclusively defeated relativism and skepticism. So we can move on. But also, I think that because Aristotle was more of a scientist, he was interested in nature and categorizing things. To him, it was almost like obvious, right? That, how certain things work in nature. It's given that they're not relative, right? The nature of a frog and how a frog functions and works, or any animal and their biological makeup. These are very objective and grounded in good evidence, and therefore there's very little room here to have any kind of skeptical considerations about that kind of knowledge. And so I think that in scientific kind of thinking influenced Aristotle and alleviated him from having to take up the mission of defeating skepticism and relativism the way Plato did. So they have a different relationship to that as a sort of their goal in their philosophical thinking. Finally, the ethics coheres with their overall kind of philosophical views that I've been talking about. So in the case of Plato, it's going to be a rationalist, dialectical process through which I get to know, piety in and of itself, and then I can learn how to apply that in individual cases. Or I can, learn about the good in and of itself through reason and through dialectic, and then ultimately, then I can apply it to my kind of life. For Aristotle, the process is going to be the other way around. Through experience, through my engagement and interaction in the world, meeting people who are good, meeting people who are pious. And the more experience that I have in the world, I learn through context and having uh, uh, having different scenarios presented to me and seeing how they turn out. So this kind of experiential knowledge is how I ultimately learn to deliberate and to make good decisions about what is right and what is good. So again, it kind of coheres with their overall metaphysics and ontology. For Aristotle, ethics is learned through experience, uh, empirically. For Plato, ethics is ultimately obtained dialectically through reason by knowing the form of the good, of justice, and so on. So this kind of gives you a whole different view. It also shows you why in the painting, I hope it's clear now, in the painting of Raphael, we have Plato pointing up, right, for the forms, and you have Aristotle pointing down, right, because it's an experience in the world, in the visible world, where we ultimately learn and obtain knowledge. I hope this has helped clarify some of the differences and some of the similarities as well. Thanks.